Weddleton.
John Weddleton.
Pete Peterson.
Chris Constant.
Forrest Dunbar.
Austin Davidson.
Felix Rivera.
Crystal Kennedy.
Meg Zalatone.
And then Ms. LaFrance had to step out of the room due to guidance from her job. And then Mr. Dyson and Mr. Perez-Revilla will not be able to join us for this work session. All right, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay. I guess to Mr. Gates, we have a S version. Is that right? We have a,
Oh,
can we have some changes? Sorry.
yes, I felt very kind of. Yeah. This is
the original.
Yep.
Did I give you the right one?
So,
yeah.
Madam Clerk, I don't think.
Oh, we got the wrong one. All right. More. Sorry. Got two.
And then while the clerk is passing that out, do we have the members of the audience that are going to be presenting? If you could introduce yourselves for the record, please. So, Mr. Sherwood, etc.
Todd Sherwood, Assistant Municipal Attorney.
Ken McCoy, Deputy Chief of Police.
Stephanie Mormon, Assistant Traffic Engineer.
Thank you. And do we have any representatives of the industry with us today? If you could introduce yourselves for the record, please.
Julie Ellison from Anchor School District.
Heather Count, Anchor School District. And Heather Candyside with GCI.
Okay, thank you. All right, go ahead, Mr. President.
We go back.
Yep,
Okay.
1 hour.
All right, so we have an S version reflecting our previous discussions. Mr. Gates, can you go through the changes?
Sure. And I'm sorry I assumed it's going to be any new draft, but it's going to changes because of the information. So I'll do my best. So basically, the first change is in whereas paragraph page 2921, and have some numbers here. The chief could provide interval citations for the other offense that we believe that this was the same as. That's now started screen device operating. Let's look at the Language Festival Library of Washington. There were 54 citations from January 17 to March 19. 4 of those were for schools and there was some more information that's interesting at each revenue. 7 of them were issued and after the college days, so we just one of the college days, 22 of them developed straight through person fixing the driveway, school bus, 21 in conjunction with another type of stuff. So the next name change on page 2, subsection B, lines 16 to 24. There was some talk that I had where people mentioned all these exceptions are so easy to use. You say that's the difference. Anybody who's about to issue citations say, well, no, I'm just calling my son's clinic, and they're just a bit broad. I got this language copied from Texas statute that have the same language, so that's where it's developed from. But there's no reason we have to be that broad, especially in these circumstances with it's very circumstances. And what suggested only we were calling the police, emergency call to police or fire, and if you go that's 911, that's as narrow as we could probably get with this kind of section of emergency call. So that's why it's down 911 maybe emergency call period. That's the basically. Then the school zone issue. The language in subsection A doesn't change. It still uses while driving a vehicle within an active school zone or on school property. So the school zone issue, how it's defined, and I gave you audience, and I'm not going to definition that I just read out from Title IX definitions of school zone adjacent to school or designated by the school traffic engineer. And what that means is the traffic engineer designates a school zone area, and it's no longer all adjacent. It's just what's been designated. So, say your situation might go. So, I also, we have this traffic engineer, she can explain a bit more about that. I figured that to be the definition here, because difficult people have seen doing regular school every hours, and maybe at the time, persons are visibly sent to the school, so it might be problematic. You have that evidence that people were visible at the time and so forth. And I understand this is just all the time, so this committee takes care of that issue. And now it's just an active school zone. The any reads that who uses the words active school zone, and that's just stated here, and that's section A. And some people asked what active means. So I did some legislative history research in HP, who authorizing statute, or authorizing legislative act for the state. It's interesting the bill went through the House and then the Senate and a couple of counties in the Senate. And then when it was on the Senate floor in session, Senator Costello moved to amend to add words in front of the school zone. And I was not able to find like the recording of that to see the debate was in the text. I contacted Senator Costello's office for staff and they recorded that. Senator Costello's intent was doing school operating hours, not in school zone, in school in operation. So that's what the staff said she meant. I said, well, is that really part of the legislative record? You know, that you could find, trying to find evidence of legislative intent. And said she spoke on the floor when she made that amendment. That's what she was saying, you know, the same thing she said she probably had. So that's where we're left with. We're active. Absent some of them removed from the legislative record, which is these common dictionary meaning, which is pretty much synonyms. So I think that similar to the previous ordinance we discussed, there's really good was not applicable. That would be something that maybe a subject of litigation would be let's see. I saw a question, perhaps, from
There's a question. Are you in that?
It doesn't matter. I think you're running it. Mr. Costa.
Thanks. So there's a colloquially understood active school zone time, which is generally speaking when the lights are flashing, which is within a time frame before and after students are transiting in and out of schools, except in the times of those schools that don't have those markers. And so what we have is a scenario in which whatever definition we choose, we have to be really clear, not just default to a term like active school zone, because that is going to, in people's minds, only be defined as whatever it is their reference point is. And so we have to be really clear what we mean.
All right, so the point of contention. Ms. Olatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, two things on that point. One, I paid really close attention to my child's school zone since we've been talking about this. And depending on which way you approach, there is not signage, actually, until you reach the school, which is on a road that dead ends into the school. And then all of a sudden, all the signs typically associated with the school are there. And that's actually the second question, I'm not sure which, is could we put signage up under the school zone signs? I mean, this would make good sense to put people on notice that this is a hands-free, cell phone, no phone, whatever zone, because I think people are going to need to be put on notice. And then I guess the last point is I'd be interested to know how school zones are treated outside of school hours. I mean, I drive the speed limit most of the time, I think, but are people really, on weekends, like what's happening?
Or in the summer when school's
Or when
out.
summer when school's out, or school might be out, because there could be school going on and we just don't know in that school.
Sure. Ms. Mormillo, can you join us at the table to address some of these issues. And now I'll go to Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, I think I want to hear from Ms. Vermillo and the school district staff. I think Ms. Zolotel has really hit on the key point, which is notice for me. On the other hand, I will say, like, a cleaner way to do this might just be say school zones, and people say, well, you know, what about in the summer? What about on weekends? Well, it's like, well, the truth is, a lot of the feedback we've gotten, and I've heard from other people as well, is why isn't this all the time everywhere in the city? You know, we already know that texting and driving is illegal. We already know that that talking on the phone without a hands-free device is dangerous. So if we just said school zones at any time, I think that actually gets closer to the public safety goal that most of the public actually wants. The question is whether we can do it legally. So I know that this law is a carve-out of state law. Do you feel, Dean, that by Senator Costello inserting the word active before school zone in the state law, does that mean that we are preempted from just saying school zones more generally? That's what I'm saying. No, their law, we can't ban people talking on cell phones in Iowa City. They've taken that authority away from us, is my understanding.
I didn't catch that last question. That last one.
Does Senator Costello's amendment to inserting active prevent us from banning this behavior in school zones at any time?
Well, I would say it prevents us from saying any time, but I wouldn't say it prevents us from active. Or the state didn't find active. So I think that, you know, that's sort of what we might challenge. There's preemption in Title 28 of the Alaska statutes without traffic codes, municipalities. This is consistent with Title 28 and for different research and local reason why. So we can show why the authorizing statute takes away, shows some special local reason that we are need to ban handheld cell phone uses and school zones. But now if we're going to apply it everywhere, or at all times, which is active, we might need to show some local reason for that. I don't know that Mr. Shore is here. Feel free to jump in and add to that for expertise.
Because isn't the unique context here is that, unless I'm misunderstanding you, a number of years ago, the state legislature passed a law that says you can't text and drive, but you can talk on the cell phone and drive, even with your hands. And by the way, cities can't stop people from doing that.
That would be my understanding.
Let's go to Mr. Sherman.
So on this topic, Dean's done a lot more on this, but I had done some background research, and this is partly addressing what Forrest was talking about. Historically, I think there was an effort in 2012, maybe 3-4 years ago, to get this through at the local level. And it was discovered because of the uniqueness of Title 28, we could not, because as you probably know, Title 28 right at the beginning says traffic laws have to be uniform throughout the state. In other areas of law, municipalities are free to vary from what the state is doing. One example is our pawn shop ordinance, and there was actually litigation on that. We're stricter than the state law. We prevailed on that as the case I handled. But when it comes to traffic, understandably, they want the same thing throughout the state. So when that effort was made a few years ago, then the brakes were kind of put on, went back to the legislature. Eventually they passed this to give authority to the municipalities. There was apparently, and there's a state, the Legislative Affairs Office has attorneys, and there's an opinion I have that kind of delved into this area, but even before this special state law was passed, a municipality could have something more restrictive along these lines if they showed they were a special case. Didn't really line out what that was, but you were having a really major problem with this, which would have been hard to say. So then the next step was to pass this particular law that allows you to do that. One of the amendments was what Dean talked about, adding the word active. Another amendment was something that said you can go hands-free. All of that tells me the state's keeping their hands in and they want this pretty narrow, so that if we try to go from active school zone, whatever that means, and that's a tough nut to crack, I know, to school zone, that's difficult, and it could create problems. And as Chris Constant said, you know, we have this common sense understanding that it's when the lights are flashing, except there aren't always lights at all there, and so that kind of cuts away from being able to have the common sense understanding, because some terms you can, but this one, and I'm the former prosecutor, and although traffic tickets, if they get litigated, usually attorneys don't get involved, but you still have to prove every element beyond reasonable doubt. And active school zone is going to be one of the elements. Now, if it just so happens it's obviously in school hours and there are kids streaming about, that's probably an easier task than what if it's when all the kids are in the classroom? Is that an active school zone then, and the lights aren't flashing where there are lights? So it's a tough nut to crack. I'm sure that wasn't all terribly helpful, but.
Thank you, Mr. Schubert. Ms. Zolotel.
Yes, perhaps active school zone could be tied to the school ground hours. I mean, and maybe someone from ASD could talk about this, but I believe school grounds are kind of dedicated to school during certain hours, and then otherwise just kind of part of the neighborhood otherwise. And maybe we could kind of get that information from ASD, and that could be, maybe that actually ties in somewhat with that common sense view.
And if I might, just a quick follow-up to that.
Sure.
The use of a school generally after school hours is like a playground or like a park, really. And so that is a good divide when you think about it, because we aren't contemplating making all parks in the municipality hands-free zones at this time. And so I think that's a good line to consider, of course, hearing from the school district.
All right, say this, Mr. Moore. What do you got?
Well, active to a traffic engineer has a very different, to us, any active device is going to be something that is actually activated during a certain hour. So seeing the language active school zone to me would indicate, and having a discussion with my counterpart at the state would indicate that the intent may have been for those school zones that have the reduced speed flashers on them. But the vast majority of our schools do not, actually. I was going to sit here and go through the Safe Routes to School manual and do a comparison of how many schools actually have flashers in comparison. But looking at the other language, and I had a conversation, like I said, with Scott Thomas, my counterpart over the state, looking at the other language that's in the statute, he doesn't know if they would have thought to use the word active in that term, whether they were thinking about an active device, because the term active school zone is not used in the MUTCD, which is the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or in the Alaska Traffic Manual, the ATM, which is actually referenced within the statute. That term, active school zone, is not used anywhere. So there is school zones and designated school zones, and even within Title IX, the way we define a school zone is it's been designated by a traffic engineer, and the way that is done is actually with the signage. So you have the school zone signage, and it can be added upon by having a reduced speed school zone flasher, but the school zone and the drug-free school zone and all of the enforcement as far as double fines, double points, all that is actually tied to the school zone signage, not if there's a flasher. So.
That's a question.
I'd actually like to see if the school district has anything to add, and then we'll get to questions.
So just while the school district is coming up, the school board did file a resolution of support for the state statute. In fact, I think they were the only school district that did statewide. So maybe they've got some special insights as to what was meant.
Cool. Tell us your secrets.
I don't know if they have many secrets. What we consider probably is,
And could you say your name for the record?
I'm sorry, Heather Felt. I'm Director of Transportation. So when students are in school is when the zones are considered active, I guess, or used, because many of our schools not only do students come and go during the time the school is starting, but they also come and go through the daytime too. Many of our schools are open campus, so it's hard to pinpoint a particular time per day, except for, I believe this, if there's a flasher, they start about 30 minutes prior to the school start time, and then in the afternoon when the students leave, they will flash another 30 minutes after the school has dismissed. So that during the middle of that time, we often have traffic still back and forth through those zones.
Thank you. So I have a series of questions. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. So a couple of clarifying questions. Mr. Mello, you had just said that the double fines are based on the signage and the area. Is that correct?
Yes.
So they're not tied to the time. So you could get could you get one of those tickets on the weekend, for example?
I would actually have to refer to ATV for that.
So as far as traffic enforcement goes, we enforce whatever the signage is for a particular zone or street anywhere in Anchorage. So if the speed limit is 25 miles per hour, that's what's posted, that's what we enforce. If it's flashing at a reduced speed of 15 miles per hour, then that's what's enforced at that time. So whatever the signage is at the particular time is what we enforce.
So I guess, I mean, I might not understand exactly how. Are there double fines as well, though? I mean, if you were, regardless of whether it's flashing or not, you're just in a school zone, and the school, and it's 25 miles per hour. Is there additional penalties for speeding in a school zone?
Only when it's flashing.
Only when it's flashing. And then, okay, that's interesting. The for the school district, when you talk about the flashers starting a half hour or an hour or whatever it is before the kids show up to class, if we were to go with Ms. Zalatel's approach, and which I think is the best idea I've heard so far, which is we're going to say these are active during school hours. When do school hours start? Do they start when the kids get there, or do they start when the flashers start, or do they start even before that when teachers are showing up to prepare their classes and that kind of thing?
I believe that I would consider it when the flashers would start, so 30 minutes prior to gives time for the students to come into the school before school actually starts.
And then what about the many schools that don't have flashers?
I would consider them at the same times. So like our elementary, they start at 9 o'clock, so those that have flashers would start the flashers about 8:30, and then they would go for that half an hour, and that's, if you decided to go with the signage thing, that would probably be what I would suggest is that time period they're walking to school.
We'd have to be pretty specific, though. It couldn't be like about 8:30. We would have to know exactly when.
I
It would start even if
apologize,
the
I
place
don't know
without
when
the
they exactly
flashers.
start those flashers. I could find out from the municipality.
We have the schedules published. It's within the school zone. Actually, the school zone, the school walking, sorry, I got to go back to the beginning now. I was just looking at, most of them are actually, for an elementary school that begins at 9, it's their Safe Routes to School manual. I wanted to get the actual title.
Okay.
Most of our elementary schools that start at 9 o'clock have flashers. If they have them, begin at 8:30. However, there are some that vary. There are some that begin at 8:20. We have some that actually begin at 7 a.m. And I think it's because they probably, for that one specifically, Chinook Elementary, it's directly next to Diamond High, so it's kind of a shared school zone for the two of them. There are two optional. It looks like they actually start at 8 o'clock, so their flasher begins at 7:15. So the schedules of the actual school zone flasher is published and publicly available in the Safe Routes to School manual.
I think the flasher is an interesting data point, but because there are a number of schools without flashers, that can't be what we base the ordinance on.
Yeah.
The definition of active. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. So I have Mr. Weddleton, Ms. Zalatel, Mr. Constant, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
You know, I'd caution saying just while school is in session, because I think of my kids' elementary school years, when there were no flashers, but we had, you know, sometimes they go to campfire in the morning, they always went in the afternoon, then we had scouts, and then we had all kinds of stuff. You know, the elementary school, and as kids know, Fletcher Community Center, you spent an awful lot of time there throughout the day. So I think the broader concept of it, more effective, really. We had trouble constantly just crossing the crosswalk in front of that school for any of those events. You know, they had, and they didn't have to be, you know, everybody coming at once. It could just be a few. So, so anyway, I just want to bother. For Stephanie, I think you said there's a definition of school zones, but then you also said some also designated school zones. Or are they different?
No. If it says school zone, pretty much the definition of school zone says a zone and adjacent to a school that has been designated by the traffic engineer. I mean, so really, to be considered a school zone, there has to be signage there. Otherwise, it could be considered grounds or streets that are next to school grounds, but they're not actually effective. And so the reason why I had Dean pull this up, just to quick, I know this is a little bit unclear, not very clear up here, but for Abbott Loop Elementary, in our school zone the school walking route manual actually has maps for every single school within the municipality of Anchorage, and the areas that are highlighted in yellow adjacent to the school are the areas that have been signed as a school zone. Now, supplementary, you'll see these little stars that are in here, and the little stars are actually showing where the flashes are. So this school, Abbott Loop Elementary, actually has school zone flashes both on Lake Otis and on 84th directly next to it. But when you scroll through and look at all 60 elementary schools, all of the middle schools and high schools, it will show the areas that have been designated, because there are some schools that actually have areas that have been designated school zone that may not be directly next to the school, but there's a trail that goes off the back of the school property that then has a crossing, that we signed that area for where the school crossing is as well.
So, school district, is there a problem with people talking on cell phones? Is this helpful to you?
Well, we're always thinking about the safety of our students, so we believe that the safety is utmost. I have seen personally, yes, people talking about their cell phones. Ultimately, the safety of students is what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Ms. Lotel.
Thank you, through the chair. For school district, what are the grounds hours for schools? So I know it's posted at my daughter's school, if the school is closed between these hours or these grounds are closed, because I think that would be a really consistent way, because then in theory, no kids should be at the school, or if they are, they're there more as part of the neighborhood versus a school session activity.
I apologize, I don't know what the hours
Can look closer
today
this
is.
afternoon.
I was gonna say, I know the schools are typically locked up by 9 p.m. That's when our last BPOs leave. They lock any gates that are left open, but that doesn't mean that they're not supposed to be locked sooner than that. I would have to look at.
And then the morning opening time?
Typically the BPOs arrive at 6 a.m.
Okay.
generally.
So we'd be looking at potentially a time between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m.
Thank you, Ms. Lotel. Mr. Constant.
So, I was going to add that there are some schools that flash their lights at lunchtime as well, not just in the morning and the afternoon.
Yes.
And so there's another variable within that context. And I am one who leans not towards maximum, say no cell phones all the time, but some reasonable course in the middle between saying you can be on your phones in these districts at these times. I think if we can come up with some charted course that doesn't just basically create a blanket that says, no, you can't do this here. So I just feel like the schools are often not used, even though some of them might be used more often. Some of them are really very much empty spaces in the middle of our neighborhoods on major thoroughfares. And so I tend to be somewhere in the middle, not to the end of that spectrum of what we should do.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Quinn Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions. So Stephanie, why don't some schools have flashers?
There's a lot of reasons. One, cost. Two, related to whether or not no charter schools have flashers, reduced speed school zones, because no charter schools have designated walking boundaries, and specifically specifically the reduced speed school zone is intended for the safety of kids that are walking to and from the school. And if you do not have a designated boundary and a safe route to get to the school, and because they're charter schools and they're lottery, you can have kids coming from anywhere in the municipality of Anchorage, and really the condition is you have to provide your own transportation. That one has been a tough nut to crack because, and when they can move locations very quickly, and sometimes we're not notified.
It's actually really interesting. I was worried about the opposite, which is that kids with higher socioeconomic backgrounds have parents who understand the process. They can argue for flashers, but really those kids are mostly going to charter schools. So it's an interesting twist.
Yeah, so none of the charter schools have them. The other ones are based upon, sometimes it is the speed of the school, the speed of the street adjacent to them. I mean, if you're next to a street such as, pretty sure it's going to be Hanshu, that has a 45-mile-per-hour corridor next to it, really, and there is a walking route back and forth, that's an area that would be considered for a reduced speed school zone. If you're within a neighborhood, a lot of the schools that are within neighborhoods that are already posted at 25 miles an hour, especially, I mean, looking at, there is a process by which they were evaluated, and it included, it includes APD, and one time it included the state troopers, they were part of it, the school district, the traffic department, the state of Alaska. There was a whole committee that would go through and do an evaluation and kind of do a determination, basically a safety risk evaluation, looking at the lighting, looking at the ped facilities, looking at what the walking routes were, where the crossings were, and so that's why some schools do and some do not.
That's great. Sounds like you're looking at all the factors.
Yeah.
Super happy to hear that. So, can I ask So, you said that you can see where school zones are designated through this. What about signs? I mean, if you're just an average person driving around using a phone.
It is shown as yellow on this map only if there are signs on the ground designating this.
Okay.
Otherwise, we would not actually show. There are some school zone maps, if you go through all of them, that actually don't have yellow. I'm trying to think I don't know if we have any schools that don't have a designated school zone, but they vary. They really do vary.
Because that seems just really confusing. I mean, I think Meg brought this up earlier, but if we don't have signs telling people this isn't, I mean, how are you supposed to know where the active school zone starts and stops, particularly on the flashers? Anyway, I think I'm just repeating things now. But and then could we, if we inserted, it seems to me that we have to potentially, Dean, insert active here if we want to move forward with this, because that's what the state allows us to regulate. Active into the anyway, you get what I'm saying, I think. Could we, from an enforcement perspective, do you think, Mr. McCoy, that you could enforce what active means in a way that would be less likely to bring a lawsuit challenging our prohibition of cell phones unless they're hand-free in an active zone? Because really that's where the rub is, right? I mean, if kids are in school and you get a ticket for talking on the phone, probably someone's not going to put a legal challenge for it because they're like, yeah, it's obvious that that's an active school zone. Whereas if it's 10 p.m. at night and you ticket them, we're going to be a lot more vulnerable in putting forward this ordinance. So I'm just wondering sort of how that could help.
Right. So the way we would approach that is if we would take the definition of active school zone, so that's during operating hours or when children are physically present. So
Well, no, but Mr. McCoy, we've taken that out.
I don't think, so Dean can speak up if he wants to, but I think we cannot define that because it's a state-defined word, but unfortunately they didn't define it. So if we use it, we need to interpret it in a way that we think is consistent with what the state meant.
Right, and I guess I should clarify with my statement. That would probably be the analysis we would use in using our judgment in enforcing that. Is school operating? Are there children present? So at 2 o'clock in the morning, are we going to be writing a citation? Most likely not. We would have to use our discretion, and I think that would be the guideline we would use.
Okay, so that makes me feel better about it.
If I may see that you were asking about who's not active for means. Well, first, I think we do need to be more active here.
Yeah.
The state didn't define active. All we heard was one senator, but she not, but the whole body, the whole legislative body, we intentional. I didn't see statements to that effect.
Yeah.
When you use legislative history to interpret a statute, we courts first look at the rules of statutory construction. They first look at the plain meaning and then they use legislative history documents. I think that it's probably, it could be better to find active in a pretty reasonable way for all local ordinance and not be contrary to the state's authorization to have this kind of active school zones. Of course, that's a little riskier than just not finding active and using the application of the big chief coordination.
So, can I ask a follow-up for Felix? So, Dean, are you suggesting then that we put active school zone, the definition back in?
Well, first we have to be taking it out. This is a draft and see what the perspectives were taking that out. So this isn't full bug yet. I think that we could leave it in, but you need to have maybe a definition that's really consistent with common sense interpretation of active. And anytime persons are receiving percent, that would be access.
And then just one more. Meg, would you pronounce your last name? I hear people saying it in really different ways, and I think we should try to learn it.
Zalatel.
Zalatel. Not Zalatel or Zalatel or
No, rhymes
Zalatel.
Rhymes with what the hell?
It's like the flattest Zalatel. Okay. Mid-season.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson.
Thanks.
So, Mr. Gates, did you have anything else to add? I had you on cue.
Yeah, I wanted to add two things. I guess one was there was a discussion about whether the school hours out there, and I actually looked into that as well to see because I guess going right because these environments and authorized duty adopted policy more allowed writing to school district's website they have a school board policies and none of them gave this is exactly what school hours mean for school hours, so I can find it. I think that the school district representative said this is skills we can do. So it's not reason anywhere that I can find. Then a second thing, I was wondering, looking at the signage. One of the earlier questions I had to Ms. Morello was if this ordinance said and included like the Texas statute that I used as a model, required signs about the city prohibition on cell phone usage. What would it cost? Those are $50,000. No, we had to procure the signs and then be able to install them at all the school zones on city. So I tried to keep these as low cost as possible to meet our school plan between. I guess I did have a question about signs for Ms. Maroon, but I think that other members already asked concerns why something else not wrong.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gates. So I have Mr. Peterson, Mr. Weddleton, and Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm looking at the top of page 4 where it's talking about the fines. And the first one says driving with a screen device operating. And then the next one says driving using a cell phone in the school zone, and they're both $500 fines. Well, we're trying to get them to use a hand-free device if they're going to use one while they're in the school zone, and then right above it, we're going to fine them $500 for doing that too. So it just seems like we're banning using cell phones, and we're telling them, no, we're not banning using cell phones. You can use a screen device, but then you could get a ticket for the screen device too. So am I missing something? How is this possible?
Well, I don't have the screen device in front of me. And in our code, all it does is reference the state statute by the state statute citation. The state statute has this number of exceptions, so you can use a screen device for navigation purposes or for your usual contacts to make a phone call. So you can use your screen device for certain things that aren't covered. You can't use it to watch a movie, while you're driving. So that's where the distinction is. There's this list of exceptions actually use screen device.
I see. So there's a list of allowed uses for screen devices in the code somewhere?
It's in the state statute, and we just kind of incorporate the statute by reference in our code section.
Okay. All right, just wondering, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Wells.
So, Deputy Chief McCoy, would it work for your purposes if we said and define an active school zone as 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. on days school is in session? Is that clear?
It'll be clear for us, yes.
Does that make sense? An active, because I know community councils were booted out at 9 p.m. After the stores up. I think they locked someone in once.
There was a movie.
This is why these community councils stop meeting in schools, because they can't.
No, that's a good idea. We should try to start community council meetings around.
Okay. Chew on that, folks. 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. on days schools in session is active. Dean, does that make sense? Is that active? Does that help me and Costello out?
I think that's, you could define it. Someone gets a ticket at 6:01 a.m. and they might just appeal and see what, you know, administrative comes up and says about that.
We can check on their phone.
The subpoena.
Yeah, you could be chief recorded.
Oh, and also add, you know, where it's signed. So we can say where it's signed during those times on the board.
Yeah, I think the only issue there is, I like the idea of these sort of pretty clean rules, you know, the right line rules, and saying 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. is a good way to do that. You saying on days schools in session, I think that might cause a little bit of a challenge, right? I mean, because the members of the public, those of us who don't have kids, don't always know when school is in session or not in session. I don't know if you ever, I don't know, with summer school, I don't know if they ever meet on weekends, but of course there are certain holidays that the school district gets off and we don't get off. But I think that still is a better rule than we've heard proposed so far. So.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. Mr. Costa.
Mr. Sherwood first. I think he might have a point to make it.
Oh, sure.
I apologize for bringing this up now. I just thought of this, but it sounds like everyone's assuming we're talking about public schools. And there is no definition of, because the other part of this is school property. And I know there's places like near where I live on Lake Otis, Hanshu and Spring Hill are in the school zone, but the Christian school on the corner is not. But that aside, you've got the school grounds part, so you might want to, you might want to tell us, lawyers, figure out the school grounds part and give an indication, because there's a lot of private schools out there with a lot of parking lots. Does it mean preschools? And I think, but I don't have it with me, that in state statute there is a definition for school grounds, and I haven't been able to find it that does include public and private. Anyway.
Actually, that's in the Alaska Traffic Manual.
Maybe that's where it is, but to avoid confusion in the event of a prosecution, it probably would be good to have a definition of what is meant by school grounds.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwood. If you don't mind, Mr. Costa, do you have an answer to that?
Just very quickly, I wanted to add to that. We don't even say school grounds; we say school property.
Or school property.
Well, that's problematic because the Anchorage School District owns a bunch of property around town. They own a huge chunk of developable land, Minnesota Theater, for example. And so I think we do need to make sure that school grounds, not the various, feudal holdings of the school district.
Mr. Gates, did you get that?
So I read the definition for designated school zone or code. I'm just going to verify. It's not in the ordinance, it's in the general definitions section. It includes public or private school. So I think that's covered.
If we use the term designated school zone.
Sure, but it does include private schools.
Yes. All right. Mr. Costa, did you have anything?
I just was back on the definition of the schools. The second phrase, where children are visibly present, is problematic. And Mr. Weddleton's proposal of during school session, during these hours, whatever the final hours that we might land on, is a reasonable approach. I think it's the most reasonable approach we've heard so far that can be generally understood by the public.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Kennedy.
Several things now. I think my first comment, it's a question, my comment, the times are important just because there are, even at the elementary age, you have kids that are coming to school before class actually starts because they've got choir or they've got whatever else. And believe me, some of them are there, if they're there, daycare, not Boys and Girls Club, campfire or something like that. You know, so there are kids going to school earlier sometimes than what you would think were the normal school hours. And they're certainly staying after school for all kinds of activities. And you especially see that in the middle school and the high school. The other thing is we have a lot of groups that use our schools as well afterward. So there are children present at a lot of different times. So if you went with that 6 to 9, that's probably a good time frame. Flashing signs, that's really an interesting thing because in Chugach Eagle River we have 12 schools. One is a charter school, so obviously doesn't have any signage. All the other schools have signage, but the only ones, and there are only 3 of them, that have flashing light signs, 3 elementaries, 1 high school, so there's 4 of them. And that is all because they're on major roads that have a 45-mile-an-hour speed zone that has to be reduced to that 20. So that's the only time that you see flashing signs is when you have to be reduced to a slower speed. And then the other schools are in neighborhoods that already have a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit for the most part. So they might be reducing it, saying that they're reducing it to 20, but they're not making a big deal out of it in terms of having the flashing signs. It's not quite that drastic of a change. So my problem with it though is I can think of one situation in our area that we have one school zone sign on Eagle River Road, which is the road that you have to turn off of, go down a side street through a neighborhood to get to Greening Middle School. But there is a school zone sign there that says, school zone, 45 miles an hour, which means that you're not supposed to go any more than 45 miles an hour on the road that's already marked 45 miles an hour anyway. So they don't reduce the speed at all. So it's nothing that anybody, if you're following the speed limit anyway, you're not going to come to that sign and go, oh, I have to slow down. Oh, I shouldn't be on my cell phone. That's just not going to happen on a road like that. So my concern becomes then, does this make this a new problem for people that are using their cell phone while they're going down that road? It's a major road through Eagle River. So if we get to the point where now we're saying, oh, it's a school zone, so now you can't be on your cell phone for that particular length, and that's not an established length at all. So again, we're back to that question of what is a school zone. And so I don't see how any of the language here really helps designate that in particular, at least in those areas where we really do have schools that are maybe nearby. There aren't necessarily kids right there. There is a walkway across that major road, that Eagle River Road. But it's also the kids on that other side of the road a lot of them are bused to their school because it's considered, more of a high traffic area. So again, in terms of being a driver who's going through that area, how do they know when that starts and when it stops, unless we start adding more signage? I don't know the answer to that one. But it certainly becomes an issue, and I certainly don't want to see people have to go, oh, I've got to put my cell phone down now, because I'm going through this area. But and maybe there's some comments. I think Meg wants to comment on that, or the other one that I really do want to look at, though, that we might be able to talk about is under Section 1A 2. It says the mobile communication device is being used with a hands-free device. This exception does not allow a person to use their hands to touch the mobile device to turn it on or turn it off. Are we really going to go to that extent to say you can't push the button on your device during that time? Because even somebody that's got a Bluetooth
you're gonna touch a button to shut that off. It's even, you know, it's considered hands-free, but you're gonna touch a button to be able to either turn it off or turn it on during that time. So does that mean you can't touch your radio dial either? But anyway.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. All right, so for the
So
time
that's
remaining, here's what I want. Mr. Gates, if you can answer that last question from Ms. Kennedy, then Mr. Dunbar, then I want to go see if there's anything else that you need for guidance on this, and then I want to hear from UCI. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Thank you for asking the answer for your question about the school zones. That was a tough one. About touching the phone to turn it on or off, that was one of my first questions when I started dropping this to sponsors. And sponsors decided they wanted to not allow touching it at all. I guess there are some devices where you turn it on or off without touching the screen. And I guess in their wisdom, don't touch it if you're in school zone. Children around. It's a policy call.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Dunbar.
So, Ms. Kennedy said something interesting about the 45 mile per hour, to 25 mile per hour. I think that also applies on Minnesota. You know, the lights flashing drops you down to 25, but I think it's always a school zone, right? Regardless of whether lights are flashing or not. Is there something, for you, Ms. Mello, is there something special about the 25 number? Do the flashing lights always drop to 25? And do the areas around schools, are they always 25? Or are there 35? Or when we consider it to be an active school zone, is it always 25 miles an hour or less?
It's actually at 20. Generally,
Okay,
if there is a reduced speed school zone that has a flasher, it's dropping it to 20.
So I wonder if there's a way that we could frame this where that is used. So you say something like, where speed limit is permanently or temporarily set to 20 mph or lower between these times in a assigned school area, right? Because I agree with Ms. Kennedy that those 45 miles per hour, whether it's Eagle River Drive or Minnesota Drive, they are technically school zones, and they would be active if we did the 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. thing. But the lights wouldn't be flashing, so people would think that they are not in an active school zone. And so we need to think of that too. But if we set it for 20 mile per hour or less, if that is indeed the number, then all of the areas around these elementary schools, the residential streets, are already set at that. Some of them are at 25? Okay, so it's 25. The point is, find me a number, if we can find a number that works, where above it would allow for Eagle River Drive in Minnesota to continue unabated, but below would capture all the residential streets and would capture every time that there is the flashers. That's what I'm saying. Like this and below. Like if you were driving 25 miles per hour or below between these times of day near a school, then you're in a school. Then essentially, you know that you're in a school zone. If you're flying past a school because there's nothing there to tell you you're not, then you can in your mind you can say, "Oh, I'm not in a school zone right now." Because again, from our perspective, if you were, we would have dropped your speed. If you're driving 45 miles per hour past the school, then we have set up a situation where you are not realistically unnoticed and you're in a school zone. Because that's ridiculous.
You're still in a drug-free school zone.
Well, the drug-free stuff is...
You can't smoke pot.
Yeah, okay, so don't shoot heroin. Don't shoot heroin, and that's fine. But I'm talking about the realistic, when you're driving, what do you think? Do you think you're in a school zone or not? And if you were on the Seward Highway and you went past the school, and technically you had gone through some kind of border we'd set up, but there was nothing to indicate that you had in terms of speed, I think most people would think, I am not currently in the school zone.
That's been my view with this process as we've had it defined all along. Is there's just a lack of clarity on how people will understand because of all the variables. And we need to come up with a standard. Yeah, we need to come up with a standard.
But the problem with the signs is, Ms. Kennedy has pointed out, and that we didn't talk about previously on Minnesota, is that some of our signs flash and some they don't. And when they're not flashing, most members of the public don't think they're in a school.
All right, so I'm sorry, we need to move on. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Marmilla, do you have anything further guidance you need from us?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Generally, I mean, this is the thing, is for a school zone, in my perspective, whether you have, the flashers are an addition. Really, that's the bells
They're
and
what makes
whistles,
it
that's,
active.
I mean, really, that's like the weird special case. There are many, the vast majority, we have 60 elementary schools, only 31 of them have flashers. We have 10 middle schools, only 6 have flashers. We have 8 high schools, only 3 have flashers. The vast majority do not have, but they all have the fluorescent yellow-green school, you know, the designation, and you know, and we have drug-free school zone, and they should also have an end school zone. Now, there are special cases where we have advance warning for crossings, that it's not specifically a school zone, but it's letting you know you're crossing the school crossing. If it's not the fluorescent yellow-green, that it is not school, it is just a regular crossing. We have a special color as defined in state code and ours that is used specifically for schools. So it is tied to the fluorescent yellow-green. And just related to this, to give everybody an FYI, we have been working on updates to our school zone policy manual because we have been told by the feds that if we are going to have double points, double fines, we do have to warn for that. And so we are going to be going through and evaluating every single one of our school zones to look at where we are missing signage perhaps. If things do disappear, get knocked down, we're not always informed. And we're going to be going through, probably starting with elementary schools because we consider the younger kids kind of higher risk, and looking at improving and making sure that we have, if there's a begin school zone, there is an end school zone. But I will tell you, not everybody pays attention to it because it is just a small placard associated.
Does that mean we're going to have new signs made in those areas for areas where there are deficiencies?
If there are identified deficiencies, yes.
So then there might be some streamlining of an opportunity if we find funds for new signage.
I would not, when I was originally speaking with Dean about this, our school zone signs are already, it's huge. It's head walking, it's the school zone, it's the speed limit, it's the drug-free school zone. To try to add a cell phone sign along with that, it's too much for a driver to take in all at once.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. All right, if we can be short and brief, please. Mr. Sherwood, do you need any more guidance from us? All right. No, you're good. What about school district? Do you need anything else? All right. Ms. Handyside, did you want to say anything?
Well, sure. I think I was invited here today as a resource if you had any questions from the industry. I don't know that I have anything specific to add to the language of the ordinance or the decision, but I can tell you that the average household right now in the U.S. of 4 has 14 connected devices, and you're spending thousands of dollars this summer to expand our footprint, to provide more coverage and more capacity, because people expect to be connected all the time. And it occurs to me that after we make the decision, or you make the decision, you'll need to really work to educate people about this and to just correct those expectations. And you know, to the extent that GCI can help you do that, we'd be pleased to do that. So.
Thank you, Ms. Handyside. Yes, Mr. Willis.
Don't go away. So you know, you do want people to know because we don't have police watching at every moment, so that's very important. But we have statewide, you're not supposed to be using your texting and stuff on the phone. How's word out on that? We don't have signs, street signs saying that. I mean, you know, but people should know if you're an idiot if you're doing it.
I don't know that word is out on that.
Beg your pardon?
I don't know that word is out on that. I know that for GCI, for people who are in our vehicles, they are not permitted to text, and they can only use voice through a handheld or through a wireless device. But I'm not sure people. Are you saying that people know not to text while driving?
It doesn't appear that many do.
You're correct.
All right.
They don't keep their deposits.
Did you want to add something?
I can also talk to
Okay, great. So, Mr. Wellington, did you have any closing comments?
No, thank you. I think we'll work on this.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Handyside. We'll go ahead and close this work session.